Okay, we're moving on into the 1920s. We'll be looking at a multifaceted general topic, uh, cultural diversity and conflict. Okay, got to try to compress this as much as I can. But by the 1920s, a number of issues that had been incubating for quite a while all seemed to come to a head at about the same time. It seems that the American population, let's just say the white population, had once had, within living memory, a high degree of cultural homogeneity. That is, it was pretty much the same culture with some regional variations, but that didn't mean that a fairly strong values consensus did not exist. We did have a values consensus, so there were not really big cultural disagreements, at least after the slavery issue got taken care of. That might have been the biggest one, North versus South on how the freed people should be treated, but that's well in the past by the 1920s. Now, as immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe picked up in the 1880s and beyond, this began to um, reduce the homogeneity. That's characteristic of all being pretty much alike. And the values consensus becomes strained more and more as Southern and Eastern European immigrants come into the United States. So by the 1920s, there are a number of conflicts that really hadn't existed before, or if they did, they were at a lower level. So the ones we're looking at here, and by the way, the ones I'm going to list, every single one of them was big during the 1920s. Some were sharply focused and sort of were dealt with in a short time. Others were more spread out down the timeline, but they were all prevalent in the 1920s, and they were all later considered to have been over and done and finished and in the past. And yet, every one of them, in one form or another, has risen to haunt us once again. Another reason why the 1920s would look familiar. If you could somehow go back there would obviously be differences, but in terms of the things that were being debated and argued about, it would look familiar to people today. Okay, no decade prior to that would. So, what were they? Immigration restriction, is that an issue today? Yes, it is. Uh, Prohibition, where a constitutional amendment outlawed the manufacture, transportation, and sale of beverage alcohol. We had a big resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, and we've not had that today, but the same things that motivated people to join the Klan 100 years ago are still kind of floating around out there, although there are not anywhere near as many extremists on that. The controversy about evolution versus creation came up and surprised everybody basically in 1925, and we'll get to that story later, how it left and came back. And then the last two things will both involve in very different ways how people outside the mainstream are treated in the United States. There's the case of two Italian immigrants who happen to be anarchists, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, the famous Sacco-Vanzetti case where these men were tried and convicted of a payroll heist where a guard and a paymaster were killed. The details will follow, but this is about whether people outside the mainstream could get a fair trial in the United States in the 1920s, and let's just say that could be a long shot. And then the presidential candidacy of a man named Al Smith, a governor of New York in the early and mid 1920s, who became the first Roman Catholic ever nominated for the presidency by a major party. The Democrats nominated him in 1928, and his religion came to put him outside the mainstream. There are ways he could have reassured people and been closer to the mainstream. Let's say it was an issue. Could someone outside the mainstream get elected president in 1928? No. And it would be difficult at any time. It would be difficult at any time. You have to calm people's fears to get elected. You have to manage to win as much of the moderate vote or the middle vote between the conservative and Democrat components in order to do that. So off we go, and probably will generally try to keep these. Each video will have to do with one of these issues. Some of them might get two. So, immigration restriction. I always have to put it in perspective. Backstory: until the 1880s, the United States had no immigration laws at all. Anyone could come from anywhere, and all that's going to happen is somebody will write your name down. That's about it. And as I've told you in another context in Unit 1, during the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, about roughly 2 million people a year had been immigrating to the U.S., almost all of them from Northwest Europe. They were coming from the same countries as the people who were already here. Some people saw a threat. There were attempts to organize to limit immigration without. They didn't get that done. There wasn't enough support for it. It wasn't ethnic prejudice. It was religious prejudice. The United States, as late as the 1840s and 50s, was almost monolithically and somewhat militantly Protestant. And the infusion of large numbers of Roman Catholics from Ireland and Germany were not warmly greeted, but no changes were made. Then the 1880s brings the new immigration. The volume of immigration multiplied 2.5 times, up to around 5 million immigrants, with about a fifth of them from Southern and Eastern Europe, points of origin not previously represented. Backs off a little bit in the 1890s. In the first decade of the 20th century, it sets an all-time record, at least up to that point. I guess that's contradictory. And 2/3 of the immigrants were of the new immigrant description. Okay. So by the 1920s, we're starting to see, second and even third generation people who fit the new immigrant profile. Now, they've thoroughly assimilated now, hardly even identifiable, and that's something, if it worries you, you should keep that in mind. American culture thus far has been able to absorb all kinds of new cultures, and we're going to have to keep doing that. Okay, unless we want to turn into Southern Europe or something in terms of their conflicts. Okay, during the 1880s, there were people who were worried about this new immigration, and there was an organization that had been formed back in the 1830s and 40s called the American Protective Association. That was reorganized, became vocal, and organized labor opposed unlimited immigration. So the U.S., for the first time, Congress passed a few relatively timid immigration laws. Serious immigration restriction did not happen because then, as now, big business didn't have a problem with it. They did in the mid-20th century, but those were for political reasons and not economic ones. Big business likes cheap labor, and they get that. That principle has not moved an inch from then to now. You bring in a lot of hungry, desperate people, they'll work for almost anything, and that will make it tougher for the poor people who are already legally here to compete. That's just how it is. There's not a villain in that piece. Okay. So, it became illegal to enter this country if you were a convict or a fugitive from justice or a draft dodger. European countries setting up a universal draft. If you had more wives or husbands, that's the normal quota. If you had a communicable disease, if you have no visible means of support. That's still part of our immigration laws. If you're just coming in penniless with no skills, you're not offering us anything, you're just going to be a burden. It's going to be difficult for you to gain admittance. There was even a kind of a weird pseudoscience at that time called phrenology. And phrenologists believed that they could feel out the lumps on your scalp and generate a character profile. They could detect if you had a criminal personality. And if you're coming into this country, you got to get past the phrenologist. You're holding your breath because they didn't throw back very many people, but they threw back some. Okay, this gets us about on the level with other industrialized countries at that time as far as immigration. All right. So By the 1920s, this is looking to some people like a crisis because after World War I shattered Western Europe, something like 700,000 people sought admittance to the United States from war shattered Europe um, in a 6 month period around 1920. So Congress rushed to deal with this, passing something known, it probably had another name, but it's called the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. This was the first time real limitations were put on immigration. They based this on the 1910 census, which a census report has all kinds of data in it, including what percent of Americans are of any given ethnicity in those days: English or Scottish or German or Dutch or French or Spanish, Italian. Those are ethnicities. Well, it put a cap on the number of immigrants who would be admitted, around 350,000, something like that. And there was a quota assigned each European country, northern, southern, western, whatever, of 3% per year of the number that were already here. So however many Americans were of, say, Italian ethnicity in 1910, that number, 3% of that number, would be admitted. So countries get quotas. So that's intended to favor people from Northwest Europe, the people who predominated in the population had already come from. They'd be easy to assimilate. The Emergency Quota Act, passed by Congress, where there were very, very few, if any, people who were not of the old immigration profile. Now, generally, with boring regularity, you're invited to see those as bad people exercising hate. Don't go there. Virtually every country in the world limits immigration. Most, if not all, countries attempt to preserve the demographic profile of the country. Mexico has very strong immigration laws, and the first sentence of their immigration law proclaims that the purpose of the law is to preserve the prevailing demographic. Demography is the study of populations. 1924, Congress got far more serious, passing the National Origins Act of 1924. It has another name drawn from its sponsors, that sort of thing. Well, this tightened things up. Okay, it reduced the total cap from 350,000 down to something like 156,000, less than half as many. It rolled the annual quota from 3% a year back to 2% a year, and it rolled the base year of the census from 1910 all the way back to 1890, when people the Southern and Eastern Europeans, new immigration profile, they were barely a trace element of the population. What is the purpose of this law? The purpose of this law is to lock in the demographic mix of the U.S. population as it stood in 1924. Did it work? Yes, it did. That law was our immigration law for 40 years. It was not changed until 1964, at which time the face of America, the ethnic face of America, had changed hardly at all since 1924. The main change had been, of course, that the new groups who were coming in were no longer anywhere near as scary because, 2 generations later, they're fully assimilated. And what was it we were worried about on them? So immigration was an issue. Is it now? Yes, it is. It's a complicated issue today because people want to make political hay out of it, and there are interests who refuse to recognize the difference between legal and illegal immigration. We have immigration laws. We like immigration. We're a nation of immigrants. Okay, 98% of us are descended from people who came here or were brought here sometime in the last 4 centuries. It's just how it is. But we have immigration laws. The United States annually admits more legal immigrants than all the other 190 or so countries in the world combined, and we still get reamed out for being too selective. Go figure. So it was an issue then, it's an issue now, it may continue to be in the future. So we'll cap off this part and do another one.